Hey, this is Accountability Checks and Balances, and today we are reading Colonization and Decolonization, a manual for Indigenous liberation in the 21st century by Zig-Zag. Quote, liberation is the task imposed upon us by our conquest and colonization. Chinwe Zhu, The West and the Rest of Us, page 33. Introduction. Colonialism, the practice of invading other lands and territories for the purpose of settlement and or resource exploitation. When an invading force confronts an indigenous population already occupying a territory, colonialism becomes a violent conflict between two hostile and opposing ways of life, with one attempting to impose its will on the other. This is the standard definition of war, and colonization itself can be considered a war for territory, involving all the means used to carry out wars: military, political, economic, psychological, diplomatic, cultural, etc. Cecil Rhodes, a British colonial official for which Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was named, articulated the motives and goals of European colonialism in the 19th century. Quote, "We must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. The colonies would also provide a dumping ground for the surplus goods produced in our factories." End quote. Due to its history and culture, European colonialism is characterized by genocidal practices, including wars of extermination, massacres of non-combatants, biological warfare, and scorched earth policies, such as destroying food and shelter. Other atrocities include the torture of prisoners, rape, and the enslavement of indigenous populations. These acts are fueled by racist and patriarchal ideology, in essence, Christianity and white supremacy, greed, and psychopathic desire to kill and inflict violence and suffering on others. Psychopath. Noun. A person with an antisocial personality disorder, manifested in aggressive, perverted, criminal, or amoral behavior without empathy or remorse, from the American Heritage Dictionary. Stages of colonialism. The methods and history of colonization are unique in every case, due to many different variables: geography, population density, resources, etc. Despite this, there are common patterns that can be easily recognized. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, colonization generally consisted of four stages: recon, invasion, occupation, and assimilation. 1. Recon. Colonialism begins first with small recon forces that map out new lands or regions and gather intelligence. These are often celebrated today as voyages of exploration and science discovery. The 1492 voyage of Columbus, for example, was a recon expedition to find a new route to Asian markets. There were only 3 ships: the Pinta, Nina, and the Santa Maria. 2. Invasion. The second phase is invasion, which begins a period of armed conflict as indigenous nations resist colonial forces. For example, when Columbus returned to the Caribbean in 1494, he had 17 ships and over 1,000 conquistadors. Invasion can begin immediately after the recon, or may be delayed by a period of trade and settlement that serve as a basis for later invasion, in essence, North America. In every case, colonial military strategy is genocidal and includes the destruction of food supplies, resources, and shelter, as well as massacres and biological warfare, disease. 3. Occupation. When indigenous peoples are militarily defeated, the occupation is expanded. a colonial government is set up to control the surviving population of natives who are contained in reservations or enslaved. By the 1700s, many colonial authorities were corporations, i.e., the Hudson's Bay Company, French Senegal Company, East India Company. They organized settlement and resource extraction, including the construction of railroads, dams, roads, ports, etc. 4. Assimilation. An important part of imposing control is the indoctrination of surviving natives into the European system. In order to do this, indigenous society and culture must be dismantled and erased as far as possible. Colonial violence, including physical destruction and biological warfare, achieved this through depopulation, often during the period of invasion. Once occupation is entrenched, this process becomes institutionalized, with generations of indigenous youth being removed from their people and forced into government or church-run schools. The period of occupation and assimilation are connected, as only through occupation can systems of assimilation be imposed. This phase can be long and drawn out over centuries, as has occurred in the Americas. 1. History of colonialism. Colonialism is neither new nor limited to any specific historical period, i.e., the colonial period of the 15th to 19th centuries. Ancient civilizations were the first to begin colonizing other lands and people. When their populations became too large and as resources became depleted, colonists were sent out to occupy and settle new lands. When these lands were already occupied, the military campaigns were created to gain control. When nations and territories were conquered, the survivors were enslaved and forced to provide resources, including human labor, food, metals, wood, spices, etc. The invaders then imposed their own forms of governance, laws, religion, and education. Over time, these populations became assimilated into the culture and society of their oppressors. Early Egyptian colonialism. In ancient Egypt, around 1500 BC or 3,500 years ago, all the methods of colonialism were already being practiced. An African scholar, Sheikh Anta Diop, described these methods. Quote, in some towns, as in Jaffa, the conquered princes were purely and simply replaced by Egyptian generals. Egyptian garrisons were stationed at strategic points, important towns and ports. 1400 years before Rome, Egypt created the first centralized empire in the world. The children of vassal, conquered princes were taken as hostages and educated in Egyptian style at the court of the Egyptian emperor in order to teach them Egyptian manners and tastes and to assimilate them to pharaonic culture and civilization. The pharaoh, or emperor, could at any moment require money, chariots, horses, compulsory war service. The vassal was constantly under the orders of the Egyptian generals. The vassals enjoyed only internal autonomy. In fact, they had lost their international sovereignty. They could not directly deal with foreign lands. End quote. From Civilization or Barbarism. European colonization. When looking at the world today, we can see that this process still continues, sometimes referred to as imperialism, globalization, or even peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. Whatever term is used, the principles of invasion, occupation, and exploitation remain the same. Today, the European states and their settler nations dominate the global system. How did this come to be? Why is it that Western civilization is now the primary economic, political, and military power in the world? The answer to these questions can be found in the history of civilization. Early civilizations concentrated vast amounts of human and material resources under the control of a central authority. The authority was usually in the form of kings and priests who based their rights to rule on spiritual or religious tradition. They controlled all governance, economic trade, law and order, education, etc. Through religion, mind control was imposed over citizens, which created a culture of obedience, slavery, and war, just as we see today. The first civilizations were established in northern Africa and Mesopotamia, comprised of the Egyptians, Sumerians, and Babylonians. Other civilizations also began in India, Asia, and the Americas, but those in Egypt and the Mideast had a direct influence on Europe. The Greeks were the main transmitters of civilized culture into Europe, based on both Egyptian and Mideast models. The Greeks, southernmost in all of Europe, were strategically located to serve just such a role. Prior to this, southern Europe was inhabited by tribal peoples. While Egyptians built massive pyramids and cities and had a written language, advanced science and astronomy, etc., Europeans were still hunting and gathering. This history tells us that colonization results from a society's culture, not its racial or biological background. This culture, based on expansion, control, and exploitation, arises from civilization. Despite this, it is the European system that now dominates the world, the result of history, geography, and the exchange of culture and technology that occurred throughout the Mediterranean. Roman colonization. The first colonized people in Western civilization were the European tribal peoples, such as the Goths in Germany and the Gauls in France and Spain. They were invaded and occupied by the Roman Empire beginning around 200 BC, some 2,300 years ago. Quote, captured territories were divided into provinces ruled by governors appointed by Rome for one-year terms. Governors ruled by army-enforced decree. Conquered people all had to pay extraordinary taxes to Rome, writes Jack C. Estrin in World History Made Simple. Early accounts by Romans described these people as worshipping Mother Earth, organized in clans and tribes, living as semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers. They were also strong and adept military forces that inflicted numerous defeats against Roman forces, some with regions never being pacified or conquered, i.e. the Scottish Picts. Despite the resistance, some areas such as present-day Spain, Portugal, and France, as well as parts of Germany and Britain, were occupied by Roman forces as long as with some regions for as long as 400 years. Forced to work as slaves, to build houses and fortifications, to serve as expendable frontline soldiers, to expand resources and manufactured goods, or as servants, cooks, janitors, barbers, tutors. These conquered peoples were also increasingly assimilated into imperial Rome. Tribal chiefs and high-ranking families were targeted for systematic assimilation. Often their children were taken and taught how to speak and read Latin, the language of Rome. Roman clothing and overall culture were imposed. After several generations, these people were effectively Romanized or Latinized, with some gaining citizenship and high-ranking positions in the Roman military or political system. These families, along with the Roman governing system and the Christian Church, served as the basis for the feudal systems which evolved in Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century BC. Perhaps more than any other region, Europe stands as a stark example of the effects of colonization and assimilation. Today, very little remains of the European tribal cultures, which were destroyed and assimilated into the Roman imperial system, which explains why European civilization is essentially fascist in nature. 1492 Invasion of the Americas. In 1492, the European colonization of the Americas began with the voyage of Christopher Columbus in command of the Nina, Pinta, and the Santa Maria. This recon expedition arrived in the Caribbean and landed on the island of present-day Haiti in the Dominican Republic, which was named Hispaniola. In 1494, Columbus returned with a second, larger force, comprised of 17 ships and 1,200 soldiers, sailors, and colonists. By 1496, it was estimated that half of the 8 million indigenous peoples on Hispaniola were dead, killed by a combination of European diseases and massacres. Both priests and conquistadors have left detailed accounts of their atrocities, killing for fun, hunting indigenous peoples as if they were animals, and devising all kinds of cruel and inhuman methods of torture. Survivors were enslaved and forced to supply animals, and devising all kinds of cruel, oh, uh, forced to supply gold, silver, and food to the conquistadors. Those who failed to meet their quotas had their hands, ears, or nose cut off. From this strategic location, military campaigns were conducted in the nearby islands. By 1510, the Spanish were relocating indigenous peoples from the Bahamas and Cuba to replace the dying slaves on Hispaniola. By 1535, Spanish conquistadors had launched military operations in New Mexico, Central America, and Peru, using guns, armor, and metal-edged weapons, as well as horses, siege catapults, war dogs, and biological warfare. The Spanish left a trail of destruction, massacres, torture, and rape. Tens of millions of indigenous people were killed within the first century. The Mexica, or Aztec, alone were reduced from some 25 million people to just 3 million. Everywhere the death rate was between 90 to 95% of the population. The European invasion of the Americas was, without question, the most devastating genocide and holocaust in history. Despite this, it is still celebrated today as a discovery. With some exceptions, the history of this Holocaust has been minimized or concealed. The main goal of the Spanish and Portuguese was to take control of the land and enslave the surviving indigenous people. Settlement was not a main objective. They established huge plantations to grow crops for export to Europe, while vast ranches were set up for cattle raising. Mines were opened to dig for gold and silver. Millions of indigenous people were enslaved and died working in these mines. In order to maintain a source of slaves, European traders turned to West Africa. There, indigenous Africans, engaged in intertribal war, traded prisoners of war with the Europeans, clearly ignorant or indifferent to the long-term effects such actions would have. As many as 15 to 20 million Africans were shipped on board slave ships, with an estimated 40 million dying from disease and starvation on the transatlantic crossing. Despite this high level of violence and destruction, Spanish and Portuguese colonial forces were largely restricted to the coastlines of Central and South America. Many interior regions resisted for 2 to 3 centuries and were never conquered by the Spaniards. The Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula, for example, withdrew into the forest lowlands, where the Spanish forces fell victim to disease and intense heat. The Maya then launched military attacks and were able to resist total Spanish control. By 1800, the Spanish laid claim to a vast region encompassing parts of South Central and North America. Despite this, it was an empire in decline, faced with ongoing indigenous resistance, slave rebellions, and even settler revolts. By the mid-1800s, settler independence movements forced the Spanish out of the Americas, with the exception of Cuba and Puerto Rico. At the time of the invasion of the Americas, Europe was in the Dark Ages, suffering from resource depletion, overpopulation, widespread poverty, and social decline. Colonialism brought new resources and wealth into Europe while destroying indigenous nations in both the Americas and Africa. It is from the colonization of the Americas that the European nations were able to further expand and dominate the world. 1498 Invasion of North America. In 1498, John Cabot, sailing under the command of the English king, claimed the east coast of present-day Newfoundland. He was followed by the French shortly after. Throughout the 1500s, the British and French attempted several colonies on the east coast of the U.S., but none survived the harsh winters, or in the south, attacks by the Spanish. Finally, in 1607, a British colony was established at Jamestown, Virginia. It survived due to the help of indigenous peoples. The tradition of Thanksgiving, adapted from indigenous peoples, arises from this. During this time, these early British settlers took great care not to engage in any offensive actions, especially as indigenous peoples were militarily stronger. At first, peace and friendship treaties were made. As colonist numbers grew, they began to seek greater land and resources, especially the agricultural lands of the indigenous peoples. By the 1620s, there was an all-out war in the Northeast, with colonists carrying out massacres and scorched earth policies. Combined with the effects of biological warfare, smallpox, these attacks gradually broke the ability of indigenous nations to militarily resist. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese in the south, the British and French found little gold or silver with which to finance large-scale invasions. Instead, they relied on trade with indigenous nations, i.e. the fur trade, as well as the gradual development of agriculture for export to Europe. For this reason, a dual policy of maintaining friendly relations with some while waging war on others to gain territory was used. Over time, however, even those who actively collaborated with the settlers were attacked, their lands taken, and their populations enslaved. A main focus for the French and British was the transfer of large numbers of citizens to the colonies in order to relieve the pressure of overpopulation, as well as to garrison them against other European powers. Settlement was therefore a major factor in the colonization of North America. As in South and Central America, indigenous populations suffered death rates of 90 to 95% across North America. Although diseases had a major impact, they were most often accompanied by wars of extermination that targeted not only men, but also women and children. Those not killed by disease or massacre suffered starvation, as villages and crops were systematically burned by heavily armed European militias. Extermination of indigenous people was an official policy of colonialism, limited only by the potential to make money through slavery. Competition between the French and the British led to a series of wars fought both in Europe and the American colonies. By 1763, France was defeated and surrendered its colonies to the British, including present-day Quebec. In turn, the British reorganized their colonial system and imposed new taxation on the colonies themselves, to help pay for the costs of war. Along with this, the British issued the 1763 Royal Proclamation. This law limited the expansion of colonies by imposing a western boundary along the Appalachian Mountains. Only British Crown forces could trade, acquire land, and conduct other business in the Indian territories. This act, which also recognized indigenous sovereignty to land, served to limit some indigenous resistance. At the time, the British were faced with an insurgency led by Pontiac, with alliance of Ottawas, Algonquin, Wyandot, and others. They had also captured 9 of 12 British forts and laid siege to Detroit for 6 months. New taxes and the 1763 Royal Proclamation angered many settlers in the original 13 colonies, especially their exclusion from gaining more land. Real estate had become a huge business, with settlers taking land by violent conquest and selling it or growing cash crops such as tobacco. In response, they organized an armed revolt against the British in order to establish an independent Euro-American empire. Settler revolts in the Americas. The Euro-American Revolution of 1775 to 83 was the first in a series of settler independence revolts in the Americas. Unrestrained by British colonial policy, the new USA began a rapid military expansion westward, killing, enslaving, or relocating indigenous peoples. At the same time, tens of thousands of European immigrants were brought in. Despite this, it would take over 100 years for indigenous resistance to be defeated by U.S. forces. In the early 1800s, inspired by the American Revolution, settler revolutions occurred throughout South and Central America, with new independent nation-states being created, i.e. Bolivia, Chile, Peru, etc. Although these movements kicked out European colonial powers, they did not liberate the indigenous peoples. Instead, it was the immigrant European elites and their descendants who assumed power. We do not refer to these examples of anti-colonial resistance. To these as examples of anti-colonial resistance. By the late 1800s, these settler governments began to take out huge loans from European banks. These loans were used to build roads, railways, dams, ports, etc., in order to better exploit the natural resources. U.S. and European corporations became heavily involved in these countries, where they could make huge profits exploiting cheap labor, land, and resources. This period established the imperial relationship between the Third World and the Western powers, based on debt and repayment of loans. African slave revolts. As early as 1526, African slaves had rebelled against their European masters. In some regions, such as Brazil, escaped Africans established liberated zones, defending them against colonial forces. In the Caribbean, Central and South America, escaped Africans also found sanctuary among indigenous peoples. During the American Revolution in the U.S., the British offered freedom to African slaves. As many as 100,000 are believed to have abandoned the slave plantations to have fought with the British. Many African units continued fighting after the British defeat. Others went to Canada, and those that didn't were re-enslaved. While the Euro-American settler elite were planting and executing their continental expansion, African slaves in Haiti rebelled and defeated French forces in 1791. This had an alarming effect on the U.S., where some began to realize the dangers of having a large African slave population. In 1800, a large slave revolt occurred in Virginia. Efforts were made to reduce the numbers of slaves. In 1808, the government banned the import of new slaves. In 1812, settler vigilantes attacked Seminole communities in Florida in an attempt to recapture escaped African slaves who had gained sanctuary among the Seminole. This began the first phase of the Seminole Wars, which cost over 1,600 dead U.S. soldiers and millions in dollars. Even after the Second Seminole War of 1835, the Seminole and their African allies remained undefeated. Meanwhile, slave revolts continued. By the 1820s, many cities had large numbers of Africans, often concentrated in certain areas. Although most were slaves, and urban slaves outnumbered those on plantations, an increasing number were also escaped slaves. They were able to find sanctuary in large numbers. As a result, many insurrections and rebellions had their origins in urbanized slaves. By the 1830s, large numbers of these slaves were being relocated to the plantations. It was also felt that too many African slaves were being exposed to education and learning too much in the cities. By the 1850s, slavery had become a dividing policy among southern and northern settler elites. The slavery-based plantation system of the South was now seen as retarding the interests of empire, threatening it with African revolution while limiting the growth of the northern industrial capitalist system. What the U.S. needed was a vast army of Euro settlers to take and hold territory, to work in the factories and farms, and to produce and consume. Between 1830 to 1860, some 5 million European settlers immigrated to the U.S. By this time, the struggle for power between the North and the South erupted into the U.S. Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Again, freedom to new African slaves was promised, this time by the Northern forces. Once again, tens of thousands of escaped slaves came and joined the Northern Union Army. With this mass withdrawal of slave labor, further strengthening the North and unable to compete against the economic and industrial capacity of the North to wage war, the South was defeated. New Africans in the South immediately organized to defend their freedom. Strikes and armed occupations of land occurred. The new Northern government offered limited political, legal, and poverty rights while attacking the most militant elements. Union soldiers also disarmed African army units or redeployed them to the ongoing Indian wars on the plains. But these reforms were too much for some Southern elite settlers, thousands of whom joined the white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan to wage a campaign of terror against blacks. Thousands of Africans were killed during state elections. The North withdrew its forces and allowed local settler regimes to regain power, who maintained a brutal system of apartheid until the 1950s civil rights struggles. Final phase of North American indigenous resistance, the 1800s. In 1812, U.S. forces attempted to invade eastern Canada. At this time, Britain was again at war with France, and the U.S. hoped to take advantage of this. They were repelled, however, by a small British force and an alliance of indigenous warriors. It is generally acknowledged that, had it not been for the involvement of the indigenous peoples, the U.S. would have been successful. This resistance was led by Tecumseh and Black Hawk, who also helped organize insurgencies against European colonial forces throughout the period. In 1838, U.S. troops forced thousands of Cherokee into prison camps, and then, in winter, on the Trail of Tears. A forced relocation, during which 1 in 4 died. Numerous other nations were also forcibly relocated, including the Choctaws, Creeks, Shawnees, Miamis, Ottawas, Delawares, and others. Many were sent to Oklahoma. In 1848, the U.S. invaded and took control of northern Mexico, including California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and Utah. That same year, gold was discovered in California, setting off an invasion of settlers that decimated indigenous nations in that region. In the 1860s, the U.S. Civil War raged. Indigenous nations on the plains and the Southwest continued to resist their colonization. Apache resistance, led by Cochise in Colorado, began at this time and would not end until the final capture of Geronimo in 1886. In 1863, the Shoshone began attacks against invading settlers and military forces in Utah and Idaho. As well, the Dene in New Mexico and Arizona began to carry out attacks against colonists. During this time, U.S., British, and Russian colonists were also active on the northwest coast. In BBC, Navy gunboats were used to bomb villages, destroying houses, canoes, and food supplies. On the plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho began to wage guerrilla war against U.S. troops and settlers. From the 1860s to the 70s, the U.S. cavalry suffered numerous defeats, including the defeat of Custer in 1876, and lost several forts. By 1855, however, the last great buffalo herd was slaughtered by settlers, depriving the plains of their single most important source of food, shelter, clothing, etc. That same year, the Métis and Cree in southern Manitoba rebelled against British Canadian authorities led by Louis Riel and Poundmaker. The British were able to use the destruction of the buffalo herds to impose control on the Plains nations in Canada, forcing them to sign treaties and live on reserves. At the same time as these military campaigns were being carried out, diseases continued to have a devastating impact on indigenous populations. At times, the intentional use of biological warfare was also used to destroy indigenous resistance. By 1890, indigenous peoples in both Canada and the U.S. were militarily defeated. That year, nearly 300 unarmed men, women, and children were massacred by the U.S. cavalry at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. At this time, the systematic assimilation of the surviving population began, with indigenous peoples relocated to reserves and generations of children forced into residential schools where they were indoctrinated with European culture and ideology, language, religion, etc. Many suffered physical, mental, and sexual abuse, while tens of thousands would die from diseases such as tuberculosis and influenza. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Although the Portuguese had begun trading and raiding along the African coast in the mid-1400s, European colonialism on the continent remained limited for several centuries. The first attempts by Portuguese forces to invade it were met with strong resistance and deadly African diseases. The main concerns of Europeans were economic trade and securing slaves for the colonization of the Americas. In North Africa, Europeans were limited by the presence of large and equally powerful Islamic civilizations. Despite the Crusades in the 10th through 12th centuries, Europe was unable to invade and conquer these empires. Until the 1800s, most of the African interior remained unmapped and unknown. It was referred to as the Dark Continent, land of black savages and deadly diseases. At this time, New antibiotics were developed, and more European explorers began to penetrate beyond the coastlines into the heart of Africa. Here they encountered nations already depopulated and weakened after centuries of the slave trade. Europeans were also armed with far more deadlier firearms, cannons, etc. As a result, a new phase of European colonialism began. In the Americas, hundreds of indigenous Africans were killed and enslaved, while European nations looted and plundered the natural resources. By this time, colonization in both North America and Africa were at similar stages. In 1876, the Lakota, led by Crazy Horse and others, destroyed Custer and the 7th Cavalry. In 1879, Zulu warriors completely destroyed British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana. Likewise, by the 1890s, machine guns were used to massacre men, women, and children, both in North America and the African Congo. In the 1920s, as a result of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was weakened. This empire held together the Arab Islamic civilizations of the Middle East. During the war, the Ottoman rulers had sided with Germany. Following their defeat, the Mideast was divided up between Western powers, especially Britain and France. They took control of countries such as Iraq, Iran, etc., as well as their oil and gas resources. In Asia, Spanish and Portuguese forces had conducted extensive recon missions during the 1400s, establishing trade with the Chinese and other Asian empires. Here again, in the face of an equally powerful civilization, the Europeans were able to simply invade and occupy, with the exception of islands such as the Philippines, invaded in 1565 by the Spanish. While Europeans were able to take control of international trade in Asia during the 16th and 17th centuries, it was not until the mid-1800s that many Asian nations came to be controlled by Europeans, primarily the French and British, including India, Burma, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, etc. World War and the rise of the USA. By the early 1900s, virtually the entire world was divided up between the primarily European and US empires. The final phase of this occurred in Africa, where the Europeans divided up the continent among themselves. After this, there were no new lands to invade and colonize. Having taken possession of the world's peoples and lands, the imperialists turned against one another as they had for centuries. World War I was the inevitable result of this power struggle for global domination. While Western Europe was devastated from 1914 to 18, with as many as 20 million killed, the U.S. remained largely untouched. Although there was widespread repression inside the U.S., including mass arrest and deportation of tens of thousands of European immigrants labeled subversives, the U.S. did not suffer any combat on its own soil. Entering the war only in 1917, the U.S. emerged in a stronger economic military position than the Europeans. As a result of the war and forced industrial production under martial law, the U.S. economy expanded. The post-war economic boom of the Roaring Twenties ended in 1929 with the collapse of the stock markets and the beginning of the Great Depression. The party was over. Seen as the result of overproduction, this economic crisis forced tens of millions around the world into unemployment, poverty, and starvation. In response to this crisis, the threat of communist revolution, such as the Russian Revolution of 1917, Many Western governments resorted to police repression, and in the case of Italy, Germany, and Spain, fascism. Nazi Germany, established in 1933, was funded and supported by many businessmen and politicians in the U.S. By 1939, Germany had invaded neighboring countries, including Austria and Poland. This aggression was used as a pretext for World War II. Portrayed as a war to end fascism, World War II was in reality a result of the unresolved power struggle that had initiated it during the First World War. While Western Europe and Asia were devastated by the war, once again the U.S. emerged unscathed and strengthened. At the same time, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, extended its control over Eastern Europe. As a result, the world was divided into two major blocs, the capitalist West and the communist East. And editor or narrators note the third world is a reference to those parts of the world which exist outside of that that framework. So oftentimes nations in the process of decolonization, that's where third world comes from. World War II and UN decolonization. As a result of the destruction of World War II, former European empires were unable to maintain direct control of their colonies as new anti-colonial movements emerged in Africa and Asia. Many of these struggles were the result of the power struggles between the US and the USSR during the Cold War. Decolonization was also promoted by the US as a means of further undermining Western European states and extending US imperialism. The result was an explosion of anti-colonial insurgencies in Africa and Asia, wars of liberation that succeeded in forcing out European powers. Some of the hardest fought battles were those of Algeria, Vietnam, Mozambique, Kenya, and Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. This period of anti-colonial war extended from the 1950s into the mid-70s. As a result of this, the United Nations was used to assimilate these new independent nation states into the global systems based on the rhetoric of peace and human rights. The UN, it should be noted, was itself set up by the US in the aftermath of World War II to impose just such a system. The US also provided funding and built the UN headquarters in New York City. At the same time, the U.S. also established the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Along with the UN, these groups were used to reconstruct the global system after the war. The main beneficiaries were U.S. corporations. The post-World War II period is often remembered as a U.S. golden age of U.S. prosperity and stability. Since its establishment, the UN has served as a convenient cover for Western imperialism, giving legal and moral attention or sanction to ongoing colonial invasions, including Korea and Vietnam Wars, the Congo, Iraq in 1991, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, etc. These are termed peacekeeping or humanitarian missions, although their primary purpose is to maintain or reimpose Western control. After gaining independence, many colonies remained dependent on the Western economic system, a legacy of colonialism, including large-scale export of agriculture, petroleum, and minerals. Decolonization, in fact, served to open up these former colonies for penetration by U.S.-based corporations. Others became dependent on the USSR for industrialization and modernization of military forces. Overall, decolonization did not fundamentally alter the imperialist relationship between the Western nations and Africa and Asia. Vietnam and U.S. domestic rebellion. Vietnam was first colonized by the French in the mid-1800s. After World War II, anti-colonial resistance to the French in Vietnam increased. By 1954, Vietnamese guerrillas had defeated the French during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The U.S., which had been aiding the French in the early 50s, began increasing its involvement. At the same time, the UN partitioned the country in half. The North was controlled by Vietnamese communists, while the South remained a puppet regime for the U.S. As Vietnamese resistance to foreign occupation continued in the South, more U.S. forces became involved. At first, a handful of special forces were sent in to train and organize anti-guerrilla forces. By 1968, over 500,000 troops were in Vietnam. At this time, the resistance movements had emerged around the world, inspired by anti-colonial wars of the time. One of the most influential was that of the Vietnamese, which created a climate of insurgency and rebellion. Inside the U.S. itself, movements such as the Black Panthers, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Indigenous, student, women's, gay and lesbian, and others began. These were also part of a broader multinational anti-war movement. During the same period, large-scale urban riots occurred, primarily by blacks, during which National Guard troops were deployed to maintain order. Many civilians were killed, and tens of millions of dollars in damage inflicted. In response to these increasing revolts and organized resistance, the FBI intensified its domestic counterinsurgency campaign, the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. Many movement organizers were killed, imprisoned, assaulted, etc. Meanwhile, U.S. forces in Vietnam became increasingly demoralized. Many citizens and soldiers alike began to question the purpose of the war. Insubordination and drug use became common among U.S. combat forces, with entire units refusing to fight or avoiding combat. Commanders became the target of fraggings, a term that arose from the practice of using grenades to kill or wound commanders seen as dangerous or reckless. Many combat veterans returned from the war, traumatized but also angered and disillusioned with their country. Some became involved in resistance movements and added their combat skills and experience to those. By the early 1970s, the face of lethal repression, urban guerrilla groups. In the face of lethal repression, urban guerrilla groups had first formed in the U.S., including the Black Liberation Movement, Puerto Rican Independentistas, and white anti-imperialists. These and many other groups carried out bombings, arsons, and armed attacks against police throughout the country. In 1773, the 71-day siege at Wounded Knee, South Dakota occurred. Faced with growing internal revolts and mounting casualties, as many as 50,000 dead, from an increasingly unpopular war, the U.S. had retreated from Vietnam by 1974. The systematic unrest and the refusal by large segments of the population to support the wars of this nature had been termed the Vietnam Syndrome. The New World Order. The term New World Order was first used by U.S. President George Bush Sr. in 1990 as the U.S. prepared to invade Iraq. This new order was the result of the collapse of the USSR and with it the entire communist East Bloc. With the demise of the USSR, the U.S. emerged as dominant global power, the strongest economic and military force in the world. With the threat of Soviet reprisal now removed, the U.S. invaded Iraq in 1991, severely damaging Iraq's military and infrastructure. As many as 200,000 civilians are estimated to have been killed. A UN embargo was then placed on Iraq, limiting imports on foods, medical supplies, and equipment necessary to rebuild. The UN also set quotas for Iraqi oil production, continuing the export of oil in exchange for food imports. U.S. UN forces also established bases around Iraq and carried out systematic bombing campaigns, including cruise missile strikes, war for oil, and global domination. The U.S. UN siege of Iraq continued until 2003 when the U.S. again invaded. The invasion of Iraq is part of a larger U.S. strategy to take direct control of Mideast oil, part of its plans for global domination. One official described it as a, quote, stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest prizes in world history, end quote. U.S. involvement in the Mideast increased after World War II, following the retreat of primarily British and French forces during the period of decolonization. Corporations such as Exxon, Gulf Oil, Standard, and Texaco moved in. Israel, established in 1948 through Zionist war and terror, is a vital part of overall U.S. control, serving as a U.S. fortress and a source of instability in the region. Other Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt, are the largest recipients of U.S. military and economic aid in the world. Planning and preparation for a direct U.S. invasion of the Mideast began in 1973, during the oil crisis, when Mideast Arab nations cut oil supplies in protest of U.S.-Israeli military aggression in the region. Following this, U.S. military forces began extensive training and preparation for desert warfare. In 1979, an Islamic revolution in Iran overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator, the Shah, and cut off a valuable source of cheap oil to the U.S. Demonstrators stormed the U.S. Embassy and took over 50 American hostages. The hostage ordeal was a humiliation and frustrating event for the U.S., which appeared impotent and helpless. In 1980, an attempted hostage rescue ended in disaster when U.S. Special Forces crashed in the Iranian desert. The hostages were released in 1981. In 1990, as Saddam Hussein gained power, the U.S. used Iraq to attack Iran. The war lasted until 1988, with 2 million Iraq and Iranian dead. During Western nations, such as the U.S., Britain, and France, supplied arms to both sides, despite widespread atrocities and the use of chemical weapons during the conflict. As the war ended, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down a civilian Iranian jet, killing nearly 300 passengers. The Iranian Revolution was a great concern to the U.S., and it quickly moved to expand its control. In 1980, the U.S. established a rapid deployment force prepared for short-notice invasion of the Middle East. From 1980 to 83, new bases were built in Saudi Arabia and Oman. In 1981, Bright Star annual training exercises began in the Mideast. In 1982, nearly 250 U.S. Marines were killed in a truck bombing in Beirut, Lebanon. The Marines were part of a UN peacekeeping mission to maintain control of Lebanon. After the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in 1989, the U.S. became an increasing target for the Islamic militant groups. It is now common knowledge that these groups had initially been trained, funded, and armed by the CIA during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, including Al-Qaeda. As a result of the September 11, 2001 attack against the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, the U.S. declared its war on terror. beginning with the military invasion and ongoing occupation of Afghanistan. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq using the pretext of weapons of mass destruction. None were found. 3 years later, in 2006, the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq continues. And not much has changed since. In Iraq, the U.S. forces face an organized and expanding insurgency, while in the U.S. itself, a growing number of people are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the war altogether. From its origin in ancient Mesopotamia, the Western imperial system has now gone full circle, invading and destroying Iraq, the homeland of Babylon itself. And as we have seen, it looks like this must have been written 20 years ago now, if it's current as of 2006, we see that the attacks and genocide of Palestine have continued under Israel. As of 2026, Israel has expanded into Lebanon, claiming a 55-village security belt last week. Iran is demanding that the atrocities in Palestine end as part of negotiations. As we know, this process is unfinished, and I think that as long as U.S. imperialism continues, the rest of the world is in a more dangerous position. 2. Impacts of colonialism. 2. A European colonial society. When considering the overall impact of colonialism on indigenous peoples, one aspect that cannot be neglected is the form of society imposed by Europeans. Although arising from the industry of Western civilization, colonial societies are defined by their oppressive relationship with indigenous populations and therefore have specific characteristics. Settler nations. Settler nations are colonies in which large numbers of European immigrants relocated and eventually set up new nation states. Canada, the U.S., New Zealand, and Australia are examples of settler nations. Settlerism is, by its very nature, parasitical, taking and exploiting not only land and resources, but also indigenous culture and knowledge. The lifestyle of most settlers is one of extreme material wealth, luxury, and privilege, characterized by an emphasis on entertainment and recreation. Although the term settlerism is used, Roman citizens lived a similar life of extreme wealth and luxury. This way of life is essentially imperialist, and this can be seen when considering modern settler nations in relation to the global system. They are imperialist nations, and the lifestyle of most of their citizens, especially Europeans, reflects this. Imperialism. Imperialism is a regional or global system arising from colonialism and based on political, economic, and military control. For example, Rome was an empire, and the word imperium, meaning command, is itself Latin in origin. At its height, Rome controlled much of Western Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. Its influence extending into Eastern Asia. With this vast empire, Rome stood as the capital, with wealth, resources, and slaves flowing to it from all around. All roads all roads lead to Rome, end quote. Unattributed. Rome controlled all trade, governance, and military forces within the empire. Today, the U.S. dominates a global imperialist system, which also includes Canada and much of Western Europe. The G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, US, and UK. Combined, these countries enforce political, economic, and military control over the rest of the world. In this international organizations such as the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank play a vital role. In Africa, Asia, and Central and South America, the majority of the world's population are forced to work in factories, mines, oil fields, farms, extracting resources, and producing goods and food primarily for export to the imperialist nations. At the same time, these impoverished countries serve as huge markets for Western corporations, selling weapons, pesticides, industrial technology and machines, etc. Control is reinforced through bank loans with strict conditions for repayment. Through this, the World Bank and IMF, for example, can dictate that a national government cut social services, open up certain industries to foreign investment, etc. Apartheid. Apartheid means apartness and comes from South Africa, once ruled by a white minority settler regime. Although racial segregation and white supremacy had already been established for several decades, in 1948 it was made an official state policy. Apartheid imposed upon strict separation of races, including whites, Africans, colored, being mixed racial groups, and Asians, mainly of East Indian origin. In devising this apartheid system, South African officials sent delegations to Canada and the US to study North American models. Until apartheid was abolished in 1993, Africans could not vote or own land. Their movement was controlled by passed laws, as was their residence and place of employment. Although at first living on reserves, 10 large Bantustans were established for Africans based on their tribal nations, beginning in the 1960s. They covered some 14% of the national territory, Africans being some 75% of the population. Also known as homelands, these were declared self-governing and even independent, although no one but South Africa recognized them. In the self-governing Bantustans, Africans lost what limited rights they had formerly had as South Africans. Bantustans were usually on poor quality land from which neither food nor industry could be created. Many Africans relocated to urban areas where they lived in townships on the outskirts of the city, serving as desperate and highly exploited workforce. The remainder of the country went to the whites and mineral corporations worked by poor Africans. Apartheid ended as a result of a long resistance campaign by Africans to overthrow the white regime. In the southern U.S., descendants of African slaves were also subjected to apartheid system until the 1950s, when the civil rights movement arose and dismantled it. Some refer to blacks as an internal colony of the U.S. Although racism has been officially denounced, its apartheid legal systems repealed, blacks in the U.S. continue to suffer from racism as an oppressed peoples. In both Canada and the U.S., formal apartheid still exists for Indigenous people. In Canada, this includes the Indian Act and the Department of Indian Affairs, which comprise a set of laws, legal status, and political systems for Indigenous peoples. Native peoples continue to live on reserves, usually on land unable to sustain the population through traditional methods. As a result, many resort to some form of resource exploitation in collaboration with corporations. One result of apartheid is an overall lack of knowledge by non-Indigenous people to their social conditions under which colonized people live. It is, in fact, the establishment of two separate worlds or social realities, i.e., colonizer and colonized. White supremacy. In European settler nations, racism is more accurately termed white supremacy. The mistaken and arrogant belief that all things good were made by Europeans who are inherently smarter, better, more beautiful, and stronger than all others. This message is constantly repeated through a variety of means, from official history to media coverage, from entertainment to the justice system. It is so widespread and pervasive that it is accepted as an unspoken truth. White supremacy is a foundation upon which European civilization is based. The belief that enabled European colonizers to engage in invasion, genocide, and slavery. Christianity was an important method by which white supremacy was maintained. During the invasion of the Americas, it was the Christian church which provided both moral and legal authority to the colonial forces. It was, in fact, the duty of Christians to conquer and possess the lands of infidels and pagans, non-Christians, which at the time really meant non-Europeans. For centuries, European settlers and colonial authorities proudly proclaimed the white supremacy as white righteous and God's will, just as colonialism was. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had several million members in the U.S., while tens of thousands joined on the Canadian prairies. Many government officials, mayors, professionals, and police were members of the KKK. As after World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany, racism as an official government policy became less popular. It was even denounced after the black civil rights struggles in the 1950s. After the rebellions of the 1960s and 70s, governments even began to claim that they were anti-racist. Despite this, white supremacy remains firmly entrenched in Western society, and non-European peoples remain racially oppressed and marginalized, despite some concessions. This is because white supremacy is deeply rooted in European history, culture, and philosophy. It is not a problem of a few people with bad attitudes, but it is instead a systemic problem maintained through social institutions, beliefs, and traditions. White supremacy is similar to patriarchy, a taboo subject that is rarely discussed because it strikes at the very core of Western society. Patriarchy. Patriarchy means male rule. Most ancient civilizations began as patriarchal systems in which adult males had all political, economic, and social power. Women had no more rights than slaves. In ancient Rome, the adult male of a household could kill his wife or sell her and their children into slavery. During the European Middle Ages, millions of women were killed during the Holy Inquisition. They were accused of being witches and pagans. In Western Europe and North America, white women could not vote until the 20th century. Most indigenous societies in North America, on the other hand, were matrilineal prior to colonization. Women had far more political, economic, and social power, and many lines of descent passed through the mother. Abuse was limited by the presence of family and community in daily life, nor were women considered the property of men. In the 1960s, a women's liberation movement emerged in North America, along with other social movements. The women's movement challenged patriarchy both in society and within the movements themselves. By the 1970s, some of this analysis had been absorbed. Eventually, some women were promoted in government and business, and the idea that women were inferior to men became less popular. Despite this, patriarchy has remained the basis of Western civilization for over 2,000 years now. Like white supremacy, patriarchy is no longer an official policy, and yet remains firmly entrenched as a way of life. Overall, men continue to enjoy greater economic, political, and social power, even though women now have equal rights. As well, women continue to be the target of male violence and abuse. In Canada, there are over 500 dead, missing Aboriginal women. In Mexico, Guatemala, etc., hundreds of women have been found raped and murdered. Prostitution is also a form of male domination and violence. When Europeans colonized the North American indigenous nations, they had to impose patriarchy through laws and policies. In Canada, band councils had to be comprised of 12 male members. Under the Indian Act, Native women who married non-natives lost their legal rights and status as natives. They could not get housing or enjoy other benefits provided by the state. Along with assimilation to European ways of life, these measures served to transfer political and economic power to native males, who today comprise the majority of band chiefs and councillors, as well as businessmen, professionals, etc. Neocolonialism. Neocolonialism means a new colonialism. It involves the use of state-funded native government, business, and organizations to indirectly control indigenous people. In Canada, for example, the government spends billions of dollars annually to maintain a system of neocolonialism, build funding band councils, Aboriginal political organizations, as well as social programs, arts and culture, etc. Quote, neocolonialism involves the use of natives to control their own people. In general, it means giving some of the benefits of the dominant society to a small privileged minority in return for their help in making the sure society in return for their help in making sure the majority cause trouble. The image of successful aboriginals in government helps create the myth that all natives have a place in the dominant society. The change from colonialism to neocolonialism is a change only in how the state controls the colonized people. Colonialism is a system in which the colonized people have no control over their lives, economically, socially, politically, or culturally. The power to make decisions in these important areas of life are almost totally in the hands of others, either the state or corporations and businesses. The state is willing to share some of the wealth of a racist system with a few natives in return for a more effective method of controlling the majority. The most threatening and effective form of neocolonialism, as devised by the state, has been its efforts to intervene and control popular native organizations which had previously been independent. They began with core grants to help the associations organize, then elected leaders of the organizations to get larger and larger salaries, and making them dependent on the state just as the native bureaucrats and government were. As the years went by, more money was provided to organizations, money for housing, economic development, and service programs, etc. The most important effect of government funding or state intervention is that the state, by manipulating grants, can determine a large extent what strategy the organizations will use. It is no coincidence that when organizations were independent of government money in the mid-60s, they followed a militant strategy when confronting government. Now, after 20 years of grants, they are following a strategy that requires subservience to the state. End quote from Howard Adams in Tortured People, The Politics of Colonization. Pyramid of power. The structure of European society is, by its very nature, a system of oppression and control. It is organized in a pyramid structure, with a small elite at the top and the masses of people at the bottom. Indigenous peoples comprise the bottom layer of this pyramid, and it can be said that it is literally built on top of them. In Mexico City, the presidential palace is built on top of an Aztec temple. The pyramid structure is one that reappears throughout civilization. reflecting the oppressive relationships and patterns upon which societies are based. The patriarchal family unit, the government, the church, the army, the corporation, all share organizations of hierarchy, central authority, and control. In society, one's position in this pyramid is determined by gender, race, and economic class. The global elite are overwhelmingly rich white males. They are descendants of the European nobility and aristocracy established at the collapse of the Roman Empire. Their rise to global power as a class began with the 1492 invasion of the Americas. This class system is maintained in the interest of the rulers, and it is protected by national police and military forces, including courts and prisons. Globally, the pyramid of power exists in the relations between nations. The predominantly Euro-American group of seven, the G7, being Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States. With Russia, it is the G8, control the international political and economic system. They are the top of the pyramid. Most of the world's countries are poor and impoverished, forming the bottom layers of the pyramid. Section B, Sociological Impact. The sociological impacts of colonialism, those that affect the entire society or nation, include genocide. According to Article 2 of the UN 1948 Convention on Genocide, quote, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. According to Article 4, persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated shall be punished whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. End quote. Acts of genocide, as defined by the UN, are common to virtually all colonial invasions and occupations of indigenous or sovereign territories. This can be seen in the patterns of military conflict, where we see massacres, biological warfare, scorched earth, assimilation, like residential schools, sterilization of indigenous women, and fostering out of native children. Clearly, genocide has been and is now being committed against indigenous peoples, including those in Canada and the USA. The most visible effects of this are the high rates of suicide, alcohol and drug addiction, mental disorders, poverty, internalized violence, and imprisonment among colonized indigenous populations. These are a direct result of colonial oppression arising from political and economic policies. That member states of the UN can so blatantly violate the conventions and international law and yet retain their status and suffer no consequences is due to the imperialist structure of the global system itself. Loss of territory and sovereignty. Sovereignty is defined as, quote, a supreme authority within a territory, end quote, free from external control and dependence. This definition is used to describe the international relations between nations which are seen as sovereign entities having total independence and control over a certain territory. A nation is often defined as a group sharing a common ethnicity, language, culture, history, and territory. Today, terms such as country and state are also used to describe nations, but a nation is more correctly defined as a group of people, not a nation-state, which often contains many nations within its borders. Along with internal governance and independence, A primary aspect of sovereignty is the ability to control who enters the territory. This control is necessary as a means of self-defense and security for the nation itself. In the face of armed aggression, this defense can only be carried out through some form of military force. Although the term has its origins in European political terms, it is generally acknowledged that indigenous nations had all the attributes of sovereignty prior to colonization. One of the earliest recognitions of this by colonial powers was in the process of treaty making, treaties being international agreements between two or more nations. Today, terms such as First Nations and self-government imply some form of sovereignty. In the U.S., tribal sovereignty is often used to describe the power of tribal governments on reserves. None of these terms, however, or the policies from which they are derived, have any basis in the actual exercise of sovereign power by indigenous peoples. Assimilation. Following the period of military invasion, and once an occupation has been established, surviving indigenous populations are then subjected to policies of assimilation. This is only possible after their military defeat. In many colonial situations, a first step in assimilation is to contain the surviving indigenous populations in a reservation system, i.e., in the South African Bantustan or reservations in the U.S. or in the North America. This is necessary to open up territory for resettlement and exploitation, while providing a basis for systemic indoctrination into European society. In many colonial situations, it is the church and missionaries who begin the process of indoctrination. A common tactic is the forcible removal of children from their families and communities and their placement in church-run schools, i.e., missions, residential or industrial schools, etc. A primary target for indoctrination are chiefs or high-ranking families. Once converted, they serve as useful collaborators, able to influence their communities and to mobilize resources. Along with education, all aspects of the colonial society are utilized in a process of assimilation, i.e., political, economic, ideological, cultural, etc. The goal is to eradicate as much of the indigenous culture and philosophy as possible, and to replace those with the European civilization. Assimilation is the final phase of colonization. What distinguishes it from previous stages of recon, invasion, and occupation is its primarily psychological aspects. It is not a military attack against the village, but a psychological attack against the mind and belief system of a people. As a result of assimilation policies in Canada and the US, generations of indigenous people have become increasingly integrated into European society. Since the 1970s, more indigenous people have become professionals, lawyers, doctors, businessmen, etc., and more have passed through universities or colleges. As a result of this increased training, band councils now self-administer government policies and are more involved in business and resource exploitation than at any time in the past. While this is promoted as progress and even decolonization, it is actually greater assimilation into the colonial society. Overall, today's generations of indigenous people show a greater degree of assimilation than previous ones. Some factors that account for this are the effects of residential schools, decline of culture, reduced reliance on traditional ways of life, greater dependence on the colonial system, increased urbanization, and ongoing exposure to Western culture through modern communications like TV, movies, music, printed materials, etc. Individual impact. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Overall, indigenous peoples can be said to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, both as a group and as individuals. Quote, traumatic events involve death or the threat of death, injury or the threat of injury. It is not just the events themselves, but the experience of those events that makes them traumatic. Trust after trauma. Some examples of traumatic events include war, natural disasters, physical or sexual assault, robbery, kidnapping, etc. PTSD is shared by survivors of trauma such as combat veterans, victims of torture, sexual or physical abuse, etc. Colonization and genocide are examples of collective trauma that impact a people's culture and identity. On an individual level, Indigenous people continue to suffer traumatic events, including widespread sexual abuse, domestic violence, suicides, police violence, imprisonment, etc. Symptoms of PTSD include depression, paranoia, panic and anxiety attacks, sleeping disorders, etc. Depression is characterized by strong feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, fatigue, irritability, irregular sleep, and the inability to feel pleasure, as well as many trauma survivors experience feelings of shame and guilt for being an unwilling accomplice when forced to participate, endure, and or witness traumatic events. Overall, one of the most profound losses overall, victims of traumatic events may have difficulty forming relationships based on trust, especially if the abuser was a family member. Women assaulted by men have difficulty trusting any men. Survivors of trauma may have eating disorders and a preoccupation with body image. Alcohol, drugs, and or sexual promiscuity are some coping methods commonly used. PTSD is just one of several possible reactions to trauma, including somatization, physical illness resulting from anger, pain, and disassociation, mentally blocking or forgetting the traumatic event. In addition, trauma survivors must deal with disbelief, rejection, and even hostility from family or community members, i.e., blame the victim. If not rejected, survivors of trauma are expected to keep silent about their experiences, especially the allegations of abuse involving community or family members. Many, but not all, of the following individual impacts of colonialism can be traced to some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Individualism, identity, and inferiority complex. With the breakdown of indigenous society, nations and families also become broken and fragmented. European values of individualism and self-interest, essentially capitalist, increasingly replaced traditional indigenous values of community and collectivity. In fact, the entire fabric of indigenous culture and society is torn apart. Quote, colonial domination, because it is total and tends to oversimplify, very soon manages to disrupt in particular fashion the cultural life of a conquered people. This cultural obliteration is made possible by the negation of national reality, loss of sovereignty, by new legal relations introduced by the occupying power, i.e. the Indian Act, by the banishment of the natives and their customs to outlying districts by colonial societies, reservations, by expropriation, theft, and by the systemic enslaving of men and women, from Fanon and Wretched of the Earth. Alongside the breakdown of family and community is the loss of culture. When confronted with systematic assimilation into European culture, the result is a loss of identity and feelings of inferiority. Quote, every effort is made to bring the colonized person to admit the inferiority of his culture, which has been transformed into instinctive patterns of behavior, to recognize the unreality of his nation and, in the last extreme, the confused and imperfect character of his own biological structure. End quote. Once again from Fanon and Wretched of the Earth. Internalized violence. As a result of the physical and psychological aspects and effects of colonialism, patterns of internalized violence and crime are established. The colonized tend to attack and victimize their own. These attacks range from violent assaults and murder to petty theft and vandalism. These patterns are common among colonized people, i.e., a leading cause of death among young black males in the U.S. are young black males. One reason the colonized prey on one another is that of proximity. One's family and community are right there, while the oppressor lives in another world. The physical realities of colonialism, the establishment of reserves and urban ghettos, along with the apartheid system, separates the colonized and the settler communities. More than physical proximity of one's own people, however, is the psychological impact of colonization. Not only is the settler community physically distant, it is also foreign and threatening. It is well guarded. The penalties for violating the settler's person or property are more severe than for violating one's own. Many forms of internalized violence arise from European colonial society itself. Widespread sexual abuse among Indigenous people in Canada and the US, for example, was first introduced through the residential school system. Children who experienced abuse by school staff, priests, and nuns returned to their communities and began abusing their own family members, resulting in intergenerational patterns of abuse that continue to this day. Alcohol, drugs, and suicide. Arising from the oppressive social conditions that colonialism creates, i.e., poverty, loss of identity, feelings of inferiority, etc., Indigenous peoples suffer from high rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide in both rural and urban communities. These are common methods of temporarily escaping the oppressive routines of day-to-day life, of suppressing trauma or tension, or ending feelings of despair and hopelessness, suicide. High rates of violent death and imprisonment among Indigenous peoples are both attributed to alcohol and drug abuse. In Saskatchewan, a study found that alcohol was involved in 45% of suicides among those 15 to 34 years of age, 92% of fatal motor vehicle accidents, over 38% of homicides, and over half of the deaths by fire and drowning, according to First Nations in Canada, page 86. Rates of suicide among Indigenous peoples in Canada are estimated at 33 per 100,000 population, compared to the national average of 13 per 100,000. Among Indigenous youth, 15 to 24 years of age, the rate is 114 per 100,000, compared to 26 per 100,000 among the general population from First Nations in Canada. According to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, a multi-million-dollar investigation into the conditions of Indigenous people in Canada, quote, "We have concluded that suicide is one of a group of symptoms ranging from truancy and law-breaking to alcohol and drug abuse and family violence that are in large part interchangeable as expressions of the burden of loss, grief, and anger experienced by Aboriginal people in Canadian society." From RCAP 195, quoted in First Nations in Canada. Health. A primary argument in favor of colonialism was that it brought the benefits of civilization to Indigenous peoples, greatly raising their standard of living. The genocidal practices of colonialism easily dismiss such claims, and yet they persist based largely on an incorrect view that native people barely managed to survive, scraping out a meager existence, and victim to all sorts of injury, disease, and death. In fact, anthropologists have long recognized that undisturbed tribal peoples are often in excellent physical condition. Colonialism, far from raising the living standard of indigenous peoples, instead plunges them into economic impoverishment, disease, and rapidly deteriorating health conditions. Drastic changes in diet resulting from limited access or destruction of traditional food sources and dependence on European food items has caused extensive health problems for indigenous people. After exposure to white flour, sugar, milk, etc., indigenous peoples began to suffer rapid tooth decay and mouth diseases. After generations of dependence on European food products, indigenous and other colonized people today suffer from high rates of diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, and heart problems. Indigenous peoples are also suffer the highest rates of diseases such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, cancer, AIDS, hepatitis, etc. In Canada, the leading cause of death among Indigenous peoples is categorized as resulting from injury, primarily motor vehicle accidents. As the Saskatchewan example shows, most of these deaths result from alcohol abuse. Death by injury accounts for more than 1/4 of all deaths among Indigenous people, with a rate of 148 per 100,000, compared to the national average of 46.9 per 100,000. Quoted from First Nations in Canada. The next most common cause of death are diseases of the circulatory system, i.e., heart attacks. This accounts for about 2/3 of all deaths among Indigenous peoples. Rates of tuberculosis are approximately 47 per 100,000, compared to the national average of 7.2 per 100,000. Diabetes has been described as one of the most prevalent chronic health problems among Indigenous peoples, causing numerous side effects including heart and circulatory disease, blindness, kidney and nerve damage, and obesity. Malnutrition, especially from protein deficiency, has become a major problem for Indigenous peoples around the world. In addition, poor health is compounded by conditions of urbanization and poverty, poor sanitation and housing, stress and trauma, as well as high levels of alcohol and drug abuse. Exposure to industrial pollutants, including chemicals such as mercury, cyanide, and uranium, as well as fertilizers, has also had disastrous impacts on the health of Indigenous peoples. In areas of extensive mining, industrial production, i.e., pulp mills, oil and gas wells, or agriculture, for example, Indigenous people suffer high rates of cancers, birth defects, stillborns, etc. This is a result of their proximity to natural resource exploitation, exposure to contamination through water and the food chain, hunting and fishing, and lack of access to proper health care. Decolonization. Decolonization is the ending of colonialism and the liberation of the colonized. This requires the dismantling of the colonial government and its entire social system upon which control and exploitation are based. Decolonization, then, is a revolutionary struggle aimed at transforming the entire social system and reestablishing the sovereignty of tribal peoples. In political terms, this means a radical decentralization of national power, i.e., the dismantling of the nation-state and the establishment of local autonomy, community and region, traditionally the village and tribal nation. As any discussion of decolonization that does not take into consideration of the deconstruction or the destruction of the colonial system and the liberation of land and people can only lead to greater assimilation and control. The demand for greater political and economic power by chiefs and councils although presented as a form of decolonization, i.e., self government, only serves to assimilate indigenous peoples further into the colonial system. Just as colonialism enters and passes through various phases, beginning first with recon missions and then the application of military force, so too does decolonization. It would be a mistake to conceive of decolonization as a single event. Instead, it is a process that begins with individuals and small groups. The primary focus is in the first phase of decolonization on disengaging from the colonial system and relearning one's history, culture, etc. This phase places a heavy emphasis on rejecting European society and embracing all that is indigenous as good and positive. Some common steps in this phase include returning to one's community, reestablishing family relations, relearning culture, including art, language, songs, ceremonies, hunting, fishing, etc. This not only counters the destructive effects of colonialism, but also instills in the indigenous person a greater respect and appreciation for their own culture and way of life. In many ways, it is a struggle for identity and purpose. While this is a crucial step in any decolonization process, without the infusion of radical and revolutionary analysis, however, the focus on cultural identity in and of itself does not necessarily lead to anti-colonial consciousness. In fact, this focus on culture alone can easily lead to conservative and even pro-colonial sentiments. Empowered by their renewed cultural identity, one frequently drawn from a mishmash of tradition, Christianity, and New Age spirituality, the decolonized individual begins to believe that nothing has really changed, that they are in fact living the way of life of their ancestors, albeit in a very different world. They rationalize their relationship to the colonial world as one of supreme adaptation, while at the same time pitting their personal power against the power of the system. In this fantasy world, inspired in no part by the system itself, the spiritualists believe that through prayer and ceremonies alone, everything will work out just fine. The influence of New Age spirituality and Christianity among indigenous peoples is not hard to find. Arising from the European slave society, these religious ideologies teach obedience and submission to authority, including the principle of nonviolence in the face of repression, a tactic of the weak elevated to a moral or spiritual principle. When confronted with the overwhelming oppression and destruction perpetuated by the system, the New Age spiritualists retreat into their fantasy world where all conflict is resolved and there are no distinctions made between oppressor and oppressed. From the very outset, then, there is a possibility for co-optation of the decolonization efforts made by individuals. This co-optation is in part engineered by the colonial system in the form of funding and publicity for cultural programs, educational materials, etc., and official recognition of high-profile collaborators as spiritual leaders. After the collaborators involved in the Indian Act banned council system, the spiritualists are often the most vocal opponents of anti-colonial resistance at the community level. They are influenced and manipulated by the political leaders to fulfill this role, and at the same time act according to their own logic, which is essentially conservative. While they actively oppose organized resistance, they are silent in regards to colonial oppression and advocate maintaining the status quo, conservatism. How is it possible that indigenous culture, the basis of decolonization, can be so easily co-opted? Culture and the Struggle for Liberation, Fanon. Frantz Fanon was an African intellectual and psychologist involved in Algeria's war for independence in the 1950s. His analysis of colonialism and its effects on colonized peoples have had a profound impact on anti-colonial resistance movements around the world. For Fanon, culture was a vital part of this resistance. As noted, Indigenous culture is a primary means of decolonization. It is both a link to our ancestral past and to another way of thinking, of seeing the world. It is the essence of our identity as Indigenous peoples and a vital part of challenging colonial ideology. Yet, as Fanon and others have observed, this culture, when not totally erased, is warped and distorted by the colonial society. Quote, the colonial situation calls a halt to national culture in almost every field. By the time a century or two has passed, there comes about a veritable emaciation, starvation, or thinning out of the stock of national culture. It becomes a set of automatic habits, some traditions of dress, and a few broken down institutions. Little movement can be discerned in such remnants of culture. There is no real creativity and no overflowing life. The poverty of the people, national oppression, and the inhibition of culture are one and the same thing. After a century of colonial domination, we find a culture which is rigid in the extreme, or rather, what we find are the dregs of culture, its mineral strata. The withering away of the reality of the nation and the death pangs of the national culture are linked to each other in mutual dependences, wrote Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. Here, Fanon describes the effects of colonization on culture, its natural development, the incorporation of new experiences, etc., are more or less stopped at the point of contact. In many ways, it is the colonial power, or anthropologist, etc., that comes to define what is traditional and what is not. The colonized, in an effort to retain traditional culture, at the same time also stop its development and impose strict limits on interpretation itself, are lost or minimized. Think powwow, or consider the influences of Christianity and New Age spiritualism on Indigenous culture. An important point Fanon makes is that people's culture is directly linked to the physical world. The colonial occupation of a nation's territory is total, affecting everything and everyone. According to Fanon, it is the anti-colonial resistance that revitalizes the culture of the colonized. Quote, it is the fight for the national existence which sets culture moving and opens it to the doors of creation. We believe that the organized undertaking by colonized people to reestablish the sovereignty of that nation constitutes the most complete and obvious cultural manifestation that exists. It is not alone in the success of the struggle, which afterwards gives validity and vigor to culture. Culture is not put into cold storage during the conflict. The struggle itself is in its development and in its internal progression sends culture along different paths and traces out entirely new ones for it. The struggle for freedom does not give back to the national culture its former value and shapes. This struggle, which aims at a fundamentally different set of relations between people, cannot leave intact either the form or content of the people's culture. After the conflict, there is not only the disappearance of colonialism, but also the disappearance of the colonized, wrote Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth. In the process of struggle, the culture of the colonized is transformed into the means of resistance, incorporating new forms of expression and interpreting traditional culture in order to make it relevant to the new colonial reality and present generations. Fanon uses the examples of literature, oral tradition, crafts, dances, songs, and ceremonies which develop alongside the anti-colonial resistance. Quote, while at the beginning the native intellectual used to produce his work to be read exclusively by the oppressor, whether with the intention of charming him or of denouncing him, now the native writer takes on the habit of addressing his or her own people. This may be properly called the literature of combat, in the sense that it calls on the whole people to fight for their existence as a nation. On another level, oral tradition, stories, epics, songs of the people, which formerly were filed away as set pieces, are now beginning to change. Storytellers who used to relate inert episodes now bring them alive and introduce them to modifications which are increasingly fundamental. There is a tendency to bring conflicts up to date and to modernize the kinds of struggle the stories evoke, together with the names of heroes and the types of weapons. The method of allusion is more and more widely used. The formula, "this all happened a long ago," is substituted by that of "what we are going to speak of happened somewhere else, but it might as well have happened here today, and it might happen tomorrow." An example of Algeria is significant in this context. From 1952 to 53 on, the storytellers, who were before that time stereotyped and tedious to listen to, completely overturned their traditional methods of storytelling and the contents of their tales. Colonialism made no mistake when from 1955 on it proceeded to arrest those storytellers systematically. Quote, "The contact of the people with the new movement gives rise to a new rhythm of life. Well before the political or fighting phase of the national movement, an attentive spectator can thus feel and see the manifestation of new vigor and feel the approaching conflict. He will note the unusual forms of expression and themes which are imbued with the power which is that of invocation, but rather of the assembling of people, a summoning together for a precise purpose. Everything works together to awaken the native sensitivity or sensibility and to make unreal and unacceptable the contemplative attitude or the acceptance of defeat. The conditions necessary for the inevitable conflict are brought together," writes Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. If we accept Fanon's analysis as correct, culture is indeed the basis of decolonization. As the resistance grows and expands, it not only reapplies traditional culture, but revitalizes it, frequently adapting new forms of expression as part of the decolonization process. A primary example of this cultural shift of new forms of expression and vigor that reveal the approaching conflict can be seen in the Mohawk resistance at Kanesatake, Hoka, in 1990. Similar in many ways to native blockades and protests which began in the 1960s period, Oka served to renew not only the concept of sovereignty, but in particular a warrior culture charged with the responsibility of defending people and territory. Extensive media coverage of the Oka crisis, including images of armed, masked warriors and the warrior unity flag, set the tone for the indigenous resistance throughout the 90s, inspiring many indigenous people and communities. When considering the process of decolonization and the tendency for many indigenous people to become co-opted, even when engaging in traditional cultural practices, a primary element we find lacking is that of the warrior. This occurs for various reasons, including the idea that such a culture is no longer necessary, i.e., the idea that modern-day warriors are now lawyers and businessmen, and that such culture is criminal, state propaganda, or that warriors and the very idea of conflict are somehow anti-spiritual, New Age, or Christian pacifism. By discarding the single most important element of indigenous culture in regards to self-defense and survival, Modern-day spiritualists and reformers revealed their inability to comprehend the full nature and extent of problems confronting indigenous peoples and the earth. The culture they promote is that which Fanon warns us of: superficial, lacking viability, rigid in the extreme, influenced by New Age or Christian ideologies. They also preach submission to oppression and exploitation. Warrior culture and fighting spirit. Decolonization, then, begins with culture, but in order to meet the objective of decolonization, liberation of land and people, this culture must of necessity include that of the warrior. Without all this, all efforts at decolonization will be vulnerable to co-optation and assimilation. This is because the warrior symbolizes and represents resistance and fighting spirit. When we consider the impacts colonialism has had on indigenous peoples, including post-traumatic stress disorder, identity crisis, feelings of inferiority, etc., it is no surprise that our communities are afflicted with such high rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, interpersonal violence, and overall dysfunction. The most extreme impact is perhaps that of suicide among indigenous youth. These are the symptoms of a broken and defeated people, so colonized that they are unable to comprehend the means by which they have, in fact, been colonized. While history and analysis can awaken people to the realities of colonial oppression, it is the suppressed culture of the warrior that can provide the necessary fighting spirit to motivate people into action. This is why warrior societies, organizations, and culture were so ruthlessly attacked by early colonial forces, and why they remain a primary target for state repression and propaganda. From the very outset, then, the warrior culture must be emphasized as part of any decolonization effort. This includes the traditional responsibilities and organization and methods of warrior societies, along with songs, crests, regalia, etc. Today, this warrior culture also includes camouflage fatigues, mass and direct action, blockades, occupation, along with specific groups and a recent history of resistance, i.e., the 1960s Red Power, American Indian Movement, Mohawk Warrior Societies, Oka, Gustafson Lake, Ipperwash, and the Native Youth Movement. All of these should be used to raise the morale and fighting spirit of our people, and especially the youth. Identifying the enemy. Along with fighting spirit, identifying the enemy is another important aspect of decolonization. Without this, the root cause of oppression cannot be clearly understood, nor can the means of liberation be seen. Although we say that the colonial society is itself the enemy, including all those who participate in and maintain the system, such a view is far too vague and implies that all European settlers are our enemies. It fails to account for internal divisions within the society, particularly those based on economic class, and limits our ability to expand resistance into the lower ranks of the settlers themselves. If we see Western society as essentially a slave system, then there are rulers and there are those who are enslaved. Even if many are unaware of their own oppressed condition, the fact that there are rulers and slaves reveals a fundamental division within the society. We should seek to exploit this division by identifying potential alliances, thereby strengthening our forces and weakening those of our enemy. Our common enemy is clearly the ruling class, which organizes and directs the system of exploitation, oppression, and control. The means by which this is accomplished is through government and corporations, who work hand in hand in order for the maximum profits to be made by corporations. In essence, then, our position is one of class war, and our common enemy is the ruling class based in the government and corporations. Disengaging from the colonial system. When we say we are in a war for territory, it must be understood that this is a total war, that the territory is not only physical. Today, this territory also includes the mental and psychological landscape. In fact, our main enemy at this time is not colonial troops or police, but instead the ideology of the system itself, the primary means of which social control is maintained. The colonial ideology is transmitted through a variety of means, including schools, TV, corporate media, movies, and pop music, including mainstream rap. Through these, the values and ways of life of the oppressor, i.e., individualism, greed, materialism, patriarchy, etc., are imposed. Even in the most remote reservation communities, the colonial way of life can be seen. A daily routine of watching TV and videos, playing video games, or listening to pop music. An important step in breaking the mind control that has been imposed is limiting exposure to these forms of communication. Put the TV, the VCR, and the video games away. Turn off the radio. Organize activities that do not center on these forms of entertainment or education. Find positive alternatives such as videos and music that truly educate and inspire. Another aspect of the daily routine of colonial society is alcohol and drugs. Despite the destructive effects on society overall, alcohol and drugs are both promoted by the system as forms of recreation and the release of stress. We can see this in the 9 to 5 work routine, in which the tired worker returns home to relax by drinking a six-pack, i.e. Homer Simpson, as well as the 5-day work week, in which weekends are seen as party time. Even those without jobs conform to this routine, in which Fridays and Saturdays are seen as party nights. Breaking these routines, disengaging from the system, is an important first step in decolonizing. It must be emphasized, however, that the objective is to limit exposure, not to cut ourselves off completely. To do so would only isolate us from the outside world and reduce our situational awareness. We need to know what our enemy is saying and doing in order to counter his efforts. At the same time, we must keep up to date with sociological trends and patterns in order to know the spirit of the time and conditions. Along with this, there is the ongoing need to organize the resistance movement. Isolating ourselves from colonial society in an effort to decolonize our minds, bodies, and spirits limits our ability to gather information, communicate, and organize. We will, of necessity, continue to use modern technological tools in our organizing so long as such means continue to function. Our objective is the liberation of land and people, not the lifelong pursuit of our individual decolonization. The return of the indigenous person living in accord with the natural world, living a free, sovereign life, will only occur after the destruction of the colonial system. We should have no illusions about this, and it is in any case a fulfillment of our obligations to the future generations that they live such a life. A slave cannot live as a free person until he or she has been liberated. The near constant interaction with the slave master, the daily routine of slavery, exploitation, and control. These are the conditions that create the need for liberation in the first place. Although we can, and do, struggle for the liberation of mind and spirit, it is a choice few are able to make. The vast majority are so indoctrinated and assimilated that they accept things as they are, both participating in and perpetuating the system itself. Nevertheless, our task is to liberate the slaves and destroy the system, and we can only do this as we liberate our mind and spirit. This is why the personal journey of decolonization is not only logical as a starting point, it is also necessary, but it has its limitations. Although total rejection of all European culture, including reading, writing, TV, etc., is correct in principle, we can see how, in practice, it limits our ability to organize and therefore fails to meet the primary objective of liberation of land and people. Now we turn our attention to this first crucial step, the liberation of mind and spirit. The liberation of mind and spirit, the pervasiveness of the colonial system, its ability to penetrate virtually all aspects of our daily lives, including relationships, values, beliefs, etc., should not be underestimated. From the moment we are born, the process of socialization begins, which has as its goal the production of obedient worker slaves. Exposure to corporate entertainment in the form of Hollywood movies, sports, music, etc., for example, begins at an early age. The educational system then provides systemic means by which indoctrination is imposed. Generally, all throughout one's childhood and youth, one is exposed to the system's ideology and way of life. Only later is the full extent of this indoctrination realized, if at all. Almost everything we are taught or told about society and the world we live in then is seen as a matrix of lies and deception. This is the realization that must be reached in order for us to consider the concept of decolonization. In this initial step at decolonization, we seek to disengage from the colonial system and to immerse ourselves in our own culture and way of life. This provides us with a positive alternative to the system, as our struggle is between two opposing and contradictory ways of life. As noted previously, however, there is a danger of co-optation without the influence of our warrior culture and the identification of a common enemy. Relearning one's culture occurs through a variety of means: participating in cultural activities, ceremonies, learning songs and dances, language, arts and crafts, traditional skills such as hunting and fishing, and living on the land are some examples. In the late 1800s, anthropologists made a concerted effort to document our cultures in the belief that we would disappear as distinct tribal peoples. Their research, while serving the interests of the colonial system, also contains vast amounts of ancestral knowledge provided by indigenous informants. This information, acquired through reading and study, is a source of decolonization that should be exploited. One of the most important methods of liberating our mind and spirit is participating in ceremonial activities. Many indigenous people recover from alcoholism and drug addiction turn to ceremonies for healing, and we should apply the same rationale in regards to decolonization. Common examples in North America include sweat lodges, fasting, potlatches, peyote, yawapi, cold water bathing, sun dances, etc. Whatever the form, these ceremonies share some common characteristics, such as the need to endure periods of discomfort or suffering, isolation, sleep deprivation, etc., all of which serve to alter one's mental state and open up channels for spiritual communication. Ceremonies also instill positive values such as sacrifice, discipline, self-control, humility, and the ability to withstand hardship. These values are essential parts of our warrior culture, and can be said that through these a warrior spirit permeated all aspects of traditional indigenous society. Contrasted with European values of individualism, greed, and materialism, we can see how ceremonies contain within them the potential to radically alter an individual's way of life and perception of the world. Active use of territory. When individuals begin the process of decolonization, disengaging from the system and immersing themselves in their own culture, activities out on the land and away from the urban, suburban environment increase. This is in accord with our strategy of disengagement and immersion in regards to personal decolonization. At the same time, the land is, in and of itself, a powerful method of liberating one's mind and spirit. One of the most crucial understandings of the colonial system is that it is an alien system, not only in that it comes from an external force, Europe, but also in the way that it is completely alienated and removed from the natural world. Civilization is a man-made system that today permeates all aspects of our lives, alienating us from the natural world. The land is not only necessary for our survival and sustenance as indigenous peoples, providing us with food, water, shelter, clothing, tools, etc., it is also the source of our culture. And the environment we live in affects our mind and spirit. The urban culture of Western society, the natural world is something to be feared, conquered, and exploited. This is the basic message of Christianity. Only by first alienating its own citizens from the land can such a perspective be accepted as true and logical. In contrast, indigenous culture is part of the natural world. Forces of nature, animals, and plants, all these form integral parts of the culture that can only be understood by being out on the land. Active use of territory is also a method of monitoring, thereby defending one's national territory. Regularly patrolling one's territory by hiking, hunting, camping out, etc., can be seen as a form of asserting sovereignty. Even more so is the active defense of territory through reoccupation camps or the construction of traditional shelters. These types of activities also involve larger numbers of people in decolonizing efforts. 4. Decolonization in North America. Quote, colonial exploitation, poverty, and endemic famine drive the native more and more to open organized revolt. The necessity for an open and decisive breach is formed progressively and imperceptibly and comes to be felt by the great majority of the people. Those tensions which hitherto were non-existent come into being. International events, the collapse of the whole sections of colonial empires, and the contradictions inherent in the colonial system strengthen and uphold the natives' combativity while promoting and giving support to national consciousness, writes Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. Decolonization, the liberation of an oppressed and colonized people, must ultimately mean the liberation of land and territory. Just as colonialism occurs in ways unique to each situation, so too does decolonization. When we consider this process in regards to our own situation in North America, it becomes clear that decolonization will be far different than other anti-colonial liberation struggles. It will more closely resemble the collapse of an empire, arising from both external and internal factors. History has many examples of the decline and collapse of imperial systems, including those of the Romans and the USSR. Decline of the Roman Empire. Ancient Rome, which once ruled from Western Europe to North Africa, rose and collapsed within the span of just over 1,000 years. The period of its greatest expansion into an empire was during 200 AD to 400 BC, a period of just 600 years. In the end, it collapsed due to overextension of its military forces, political corruption and instability, internal social decline, and rebellion. More police and repressive laws failed to stop ongoing revolts by slaves, peasants, and colonies, while more soldiers sent to the frontiers could not stop growing tribal insurgencies, often led by war chiefs formerly trained by the Roman military. The more imperial power Rome gained through conquest, the greater the wealth and privilege of its citizens. At the same time, the more it conquered, the more it divided its society became as new colonized subjects and territories were assimilated. In the end, Rome faced both internal and external threats that converged to create systemic breakdown. Rome itself was invaded, looted, and even occupied for periods of time by the same barbarian tribes it had invaded and colonized. Collapse of the USSR. In the 1970s, the USSR seemed all-powerful and monolithic. It was the second largest superpower next to the US, dominating Eastern Europe and numerous client states in Africa and Asia. In the 1980s, however, it was involved in a losing war in Afghanistan, which cost billions and demoralized much of the domestic population, just as Vietnam had done to the US. Soviet citizens became increasingly disillusioned with the political system dominated by the corrupt Communist Party. The economy continued to decline as the country experienced a worsening ecological crisis. This resulted from widespread industrial pollution and waste and included the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. Entire regions and lakes were turned into deserts or wastelands. By 1991, these factors converged and led to the collapse of the USSR when many of the republics seceded and declared independence. Decline of the USA as of 2006. Today, the U.S. dominates the global imperialist system, seemingly all-powerful. Nevertheless, it faces both internal and external threats not unlike those found in Rome, but on a far greater scale. Its military forces are spread around the world in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. Nearly 150,000 combat troops are presently deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. On its southern border, poverty and exploitation have driven millions of Mexicans to immigrate into the U.S. while creating insurgent movements within Mexico itself. Internally, the U.S. is more polarized and divided than at any time since the Vietnam War, a period characterized by widespread rebellion and resistance. Many citizens have become increasingly disillusioned with the political system, ranging from leftist to right-wing patriot movements. The 2000 U.S. presidential elections, which saw George W. Bush take power, are seen by many as the result of electoral fraud, in which millions of primarily African American votes were disqualified in Florida. Following the September 11, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the U.S. federal government immediately passed the USA Patriot Act and began forming a new Department of Homeland Security. At the same time, it launched its War on Terror, consisting of the first invasion of Afghanistan, followed by Iraq in 2003. The Patriot Act and Department of Homeland Security have established a domestic police state, a trend set in motion with the 1960s-70s period of domestic counterinsurgency. Today, this police state has established broad, sweeping powers for the police, FBI, and intelligence agents to carry out surveillance, arrests, secret trials, and deportations. Hundreds of primarily Arab nationals remain in jails across the country, while color-coded terror alerts continue to be issued by Homeland Security, at times consisting of border closures and the deployment of heavily armed police in major cities. These internal security measures have further polarized U.S. society, with growing numbers of citizens beginning to question the entire premise of a war on terror, and in particular, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was based on falsified evidence of weapons of mass destruction and Iraq's ties to al-Qaeda. Despite extensive propaganda campaign, disillusionment and cynicism continue to grow. An empire divided. Poverty, drugs, crime, and police repression continue to increase throughout the U.S., creating greater social tension and conflict, based primarily on racist oppression. In 1970, the number of persons in U.S. federal or state prisons was around 200,000. Over the past 30 years, this number has increased to over 2 million, some 65% of which are black and 25% Latino. Black people in the U.S. have been a major catalyst for domestic resistance since at least the 1950s, i.e. the civil rights struggle, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. During the 60s, the Black Liberation Movement, i.e. the Black Panthers, was also a major contributor to social rebellion within the U.S. This is due to the racist oppression of U.S. society and the size of the black population itself, primarily urbanized. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there are approximately 300 million U.S. citizens. African Americans comprise some 36 million, or 15%. Mexicans, Chicanos, and immigrants from Central America, referred to as Latinos or Latinas, comprise some 40 million or 18% of the total population. They are the fastest growing population in the U.S. In the 1950s, they were an estimated 5 million. There are also an estimated 10 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S., most from Mexico. Indigenous peoples, not including the Mexican nation, are an estimated 2 million. Combined, these colonized peoples are some 85 million, over 30% of the entire population. Added to this are millions of Asian and Arab immigrants, many of whom are also impoverished and subject to racist oppression. The great potential for revolt of this suppressed underclass can be seen in the rebellions of the 60s and 70s, primarily under urban black people, and again in 1992, when major cities saw large-scale rioting after Rodney King trial in Los Angeles. And since this has been written, we've seen 2020 and beyond. Throughout the 90s, there was an overall renewal of rebellion in North America, beginning with the 1990 Oka crisis in Canada, the 1992 LA riots, the 1994 Zapatista uprising in Mexico, and the 1999 anti-WTO riots in Seattle. And social impact, or in 1993, U.S. federal agents massacred over 80 men, women, and children at Waco, Texas. All of these events had major social impacts and revealed the growing potential for revolt throughout society, even within elements of the white settler population. Despite these sporadic rebellions and confrontations, it is difficult to conceive of mass organized resistance to the system here in North America under present social conditions. In fact, the situation appears counter-revolutionary and ultimately hopeless. Imagine organizing revolution in Babylon, because that's what we're trying to do. It is therefore necessary to broaden our analysis. The most important observation is that the vast majority of the world's population are oppressed and impoverished by the global system in South and Central America, Africa, and Asia. In these regions, we find not only conditions of extreme exploitation, but also a far higher level of resistance and struggle. These struggles have an enormous impact on the imperialist system, creating economic uncertainty, limiting corporate access to resources, and requiring massive amounts of military aid or intervention. More on drugs, more on terror. Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. In Mexico, the Zapatista rebellion had a profound effect on Mexican society after 10 years of struggle. It has renewed the fighting spirits of indigenous peoples and unified many diverse social movements. The Zapatistas have also established autonomous zones in Chiapas based on principles of political autonomy and self-organization. It has promoted the role and status of women in Mexican society. In several Mexican states, over a dozen new guerrilla movements have emerged. These factors have caused increasing concern for U.S. authorities, which had supplied the U.S. state with funding, training, and new military equipment in order to wage counterinsurgency warfare, most under the pretext of the war on drugs. Foremost among U.S. concerns is the threat of economic disruption posed by Mexican insurgents, as well as the danger of contagion and the spreading of Mexico's revolutionary and insurgent culture within the U.S. domestic population. During the Mexican Revolution in 1917, some 35,000 U.S. troops were placed on the border to stop immigration. Following the 94 Zapatista rebellion, the U.S. intensified efforts to seal off its southern border. The INS greatly expanded its border patrol, increasing from 980 agents in 1994 to 2,264 in 1998. The INS annual budget nearly tripled from $1.5 billion to $4.2 billion during the same period. The result has been the creation of a militarized zone along the U.S.-Mexico border with joint police-military operations, checkpoints on roads and highways, counter-patrolling, use of floodlights to illuminate areas, etc. Along with racist anti-immigrant laws, the result of this official policy has been a substantial increase in human rights violations. INS prisons have also increased their daily capacity from 8,279 in 1996 to 20,000 by 2001. Each year, some 200,000 persons are detained in the ISS and the INS. Mexico, and by extension the U.S. Southwest, is clearly a strategic point to which our enemy devotes considerable resources. The Mexican population, both in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest, are seen as hostile and dangerous. Despite this, Mexicanos are a large and necessary part of U.S. society, serving as a highly exploitable source of manual labor. Like new Africans, the Mexica-Chicano peoples are a strategic factor in decolonization. Insurgency in Iraq. Today, one of the most critical regions for U.S. imperialism is the Middle East, and in particular, its oil and gas resources. This region alone contains 2/3 of all known petroleum supplies and is vital to the Western industrial system as a whole. European nations, as well as those in Asia, are increasingly dependent on these supplies. U.S. plans for global domination require direct control of the Mideast oil. Whoever controls this region exercises control over the global system itself. For this reason, the U.S. invasion of Iraq has not been supported by most European nations, who see it as an attempt by the U.S. to assert control while undermining their own positions. Faced with a growing insurgency in Iraq, the U.S. is now involved in a war from which it cannot simply withdraw, but which ultimately it cannot win. Wow, same 20 years later. As Vietnam showed, large segments of U.S. population are unwilling to support wars of this nature and are far less loyal to the system than during World Wars I and II. And as economic conditions continue to decline, the U.S. will experience increasing social conflict from within, while resistance in the Middle East and other regions will also expand, requiring ever greater deployment of police and military forces. As noted, U.S. society is deeply divided by race, and this is reflected in its military forces. Asian, African, and Indigenous Latino peoples comprise a disproportionate number of frontline combat troops, and therefore casualties. During Vietnam, racism in the U.S. military contributed to a culture of mutiny, desertion, and even the killing of commanders seen as racist or willing to sacrifice troops. U.S. troops were also demoralized by their inability to stop guerrilla attacks, mounting casualties, and widespread drug use, and blatant injustice of their actions. Already, U.S. troops in Iraq have become demoralized and disillusioned with their mission. Many citizens have come to question the legitimacy of the war itself. Within months of the invasion, the largest anti-war demonstrations occurred around the world. Not until late into the 60s, almost 5 years after escalating U.S. involvement, were there similar mass demonstrations against the Vietnam War. As casualties continue to mount, U.S. public opinion is increasingly turning against the occupation in Iraq, threatening to further polarize U.S. society. Crises, conflict, and resistance potential. The global environment is rapidly deteriorating due to industrial pollution and resource depletion. Global warming is already causing extreme weather patterns, including storms, droughts, deadly heat waves, bug infestations, forest fires, melting of polar ice caps and glaciers, etc., all of which have negative effects on the global economic system. Within the G7, Globalization and neoliberal trade policies have shifted large amounts of industrial production to less developed countries where labor and resources are far cheaper. This has resulted in growing unemployment within the most industrialized nations. Despite decades of economic growth, poverty has expanded around the world and within the G7 nations themselves. Only the rich and certain middle-class sectors have benefited from the process of globalization, another term for imperialism. Today, overall economic and social conditions are worse than in the 1960s, a decade that saw widespread social rebellion. The convergence of war, economic decline, ecological crises will continue to lead to greater overall social conflict within the imperialist nation in the years to come. It is this growing conflict that will create changes in the present social conditions, which will create greater opportunities for organized resistance. The rulers are well aware of this, and it is for this reason that state repression is now being established as a primary means of social control, i.e., greatly expanded police, military forces, new anti-terror laws, etc. As these crises deepen, the system becomes more and more vulnerable. When colonial or imperial systems weaken, this has been the time at which colonized nations have advanced. We can see this in ancient Rome, in the post-World War II period, and in the collapse of the USSR. If this analysis is correct, we are now in the period that can be described as the calm before the storm, a storm that will eventually shake the very foundations of the imperial system itself. It is this growing potential for social conflict and systemic breakdown that provides the best possibility for decolonization at both national and international levels. So that is originally from Warrior Publications, over 500 years of indigenous resistance. I see a lot of what has come to bear from what was predicted when this was written. I was 20 then, and so I was doing door-to-door fundraising and community organizing. And so a lot of the projections that we were discussing, I have now been able to look back and see, has there been overfishing in these areas or decimation of these populations, and it's worse than I expected. I really didn't think things could become this drastically different from 86 to 2006 and from 2006 to 2026. It's the end of the U.S. empire. Right now we have Trump overextending the military in another war in Iran for oil. He's working on going into Cuba. We're in Venezuela. We're bombing commercial ships in the Pacific and in the Gulf. It's completely unacceptable, and there is absolutely nothing written in the Constitution that actually protects us, because even what's on paper isn't enforced. And the reality is, the Constitution was written for a minority of people that wasn't intended to include us. The Constitution offers some very important rights. However, the Constitution isn't going to save us. And this settler state of the United States of America is only going to cause more and more damage. We have a responsibility to ourselves, to each other, and to the future to fix this. And there are a lot of ways that we can fix this. The revolution isn't in the future. It happens now. It starts with learning how to grow food and how to share with your neighbors, and that is how we plant the groundwork for a revolution. And that has been a big strength for the Zapatista movement in Mexico, because in that area you have 50% or more indigenous ancestry in the people. So there is a pre-existing framework for how life was before a current government. There's also cultural and ties to the area and to the people. So in order to have a sustained revolution where you can see a difference between Chiapas and Rojava, where it's a much younger autonomous region and is under a lot of threat right now. It's decolonization in two different examples that we can look at right now and get ideas and support each other, because it is up to us to fix this, and I believe that we will win. So if you enjoyed this, you can check out Brett and Some Books on YouTube. I have a playlist there, zines and pamphlets, that has like over 70 articles or essays or chapters of books. So you can check out all kinds of different things. This project is to facilitate political education and to create anti-capitalist media that we can consume and grow and learn instead of just be advertised to. Thanks.